Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And I'd like to welcome our first guest, Sheriff Dennis Lima. Good morning, Sheriff. How are you?
Good morning. I'm wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you for joining us. So, first, to get things started, you obviously are a busy sheriff. You have a lot of roles and responsibilities, but you've really stepped up as co chair of Project Opioid in the last 2 years. So, tell me, what made you interested in joining Project Opioid and what keeps you going and dedicating so much time to this cause?
Well, thank you for having me. And I will tell you that early on in my life in public service, I recognized that the greatest responsibility of a civilized society is to protect and preserve human life. And there's actually a biological change that occurs in the body when you actually help somebody. And I would like to think that most law enforcement officers that get into the business are in search of that. As cliche as it may sound, you want to help people with their life, make things a little bit better. But we know that serotonin is released in the brain and the body, and it just makes you feel good about what you're doing. And I think that right now, that's what this world needs is a little bit of kind of coming together, helping our fellow brothers and sisters out. And I think that we're making a difference through the work that we're doing with Project Opioid.
Sheriff, so much has changed through the pandemic, and we're seeing so many different things on the streets. What are you seeing, and what should our listeners be aware of what's happening with the opioid epidemic?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think as a society, we have a limited capacity to deal with multiple crises at one time. And I think that it wasn't that long ago where we talked about the effects of opioid use disorder having a negative effect on the average life expectancy of a U.S. citizen. When our Attorney General Ashley Moody came into office, she had asked me to kind of take on a leadership role when it came to addressing this from across the state. And I think that when we started the research, 2.5 years ago, we were losing 19 people a day to an opioid-related overdose across the state of Florida. What we know and what we've seen now is this unbelievable spike in dependency. In Seminole County alone, which is arguably one of the most affluent counties, great school system, very low unemployment, we have seen a 60% plus increase in overdoses and a 30 plus percent increase in overdose deaths in the last year. And to put that in kind of a raw number comparison, we're talking about more than 740 overdoses in 2020 and more than 110 people unfortunately overdosed and died. And that before COVID uh,
Right.
tops the charts with people dying of anything within our community.
Those are amazing numbers. I mean, that's just so disturbing that so many people in such a small, relatively small geographic area are dying of overdose. What do you attribute this to? What do you think's going on in Seminole County and across the state of Florida that would cause such an increase in overdoses?
Our numbers are actually similar numbers across the country. Unfortunately, I don't know that every area that has the greatest effect of this are as familiar with what their numbers actually are, because we're really talking statistically about three touch points. Typically, you become a stat when you are the mortality rates, or you're involved with the criminal justice system, or you are medically treated in one way or another, either EMS or you're the recipient of Narcan. But we know that Big Pharma has introduced unprecedented amounts of people to opioids.
Right.
We know that 80% of the people that are now dependent were at one time legally prescribed the drug by somebody that they trusted. I think that we've made some great progress with educating physicians and medical doctors, but the presence of fentanyl and carfentanil has resulted in unprecedented deaths. And as a quick reminder, fentanyl is 100 times more potent than morphine, 50 times more potent than heroin, and carfentanil is 100 times more potent than fentanyl. And what we're seeing is a lot of drugs that people have become accustomed to taking, whether it's Oxycontin, 80 milligrams, they're being made in clandestine labs in somebody's bathroom, quite frankly. And there's other substances that are now being laced with this deadly substance. A microgram is a lethal dose, or the equivalent of 8 grains of salt. So then we're seeing it in again, cocaine. We're seeing it in other substances that people are taking. And when we revive people with the use of Narcan, which is an opioid antagonist, we're asking people, how long have you been taking heroin? And they're looking at us and saying, I don't take heroin. I smoke a little bit of marijuana, or I've used cocaine. And again, their drugs are laced with that. I think that the spike over the past year comes from this situations of despair. If people were dependent on a substance before COVID-19 hit, before they were losing their jobs, faced with unemployment and potential homelessness, they only turned to their substance to cope with the stress at a greater level. And I think that anyone who studies recovery knows that it is very much a social environment. And although we have telehealth and all of that, sometimes it's not until somebody who you are around sees a change in behavior or sees some characteristics that really sparks some questions and conversations. But unfortunately, the unintended consequence of COVID-19 is people have not been around the social networks that can help lift people up and support them as much as they were before.
Excellent statistics, Sheriff. Certainly, if people need help, they can reach out to Aspire and get an assessment by calling 407-875-3700. But also, what are you seeing in community for supports, and how can people reach out into our community and work with law enforcement to get the help they need?
Well, I want to encourage people to actually follow up with that and reach out to Aspire. And we've got such great partnerships and great networks here in the Central Florida region, all contiguous counties. And what is absolutely wonderful, about this effort is saving lives is something that everybody can get behind. And what has made it a little bit easier to kind of advocate for support is, as a criminal justice community, we have identified that this is not a situation of making a bad person good, but rather a sick person well. And this is a medical condition, one that can be easily treated. But sometimes people are fearful to reach out to law enforcement or to call 911. And I want to remind our listeners this morning and our viewers that there is good Samaritan laws, that law enforcement agencies are there to really save lives first. And if you are ever around somebody who overdoses, or even participate in that process with them, that calling 911, you are protected through the Good Samaritan law, where there's no questions asked, that we want to save a life first, and then we want to prevent it from occurring in the first place. That is so important, and we recognize that relapse is a part of recovery, and to understand what's going on here is so important to change the face of addiction and dependency.
So, Sheriff, just to reiterate the Good Samaritan law. So that means if I'm with my friend and we are both using drugs and she overdoses, I use Narcan or I call 911, what will happen to me?
Absolutely nothing. We not only nothing will happen with you, but we treat the patient that has overdosed as a victim in this particular scenario. We want to get the person the help that they need, and we do that through our partnering organizations. We've actually done some pretty innovative things here in Seminole County with our relationship with Aspire and Advent Health and Navigators, and our our intent is not only to help that person, but that person's loved ones and family members chart a course back towards sobriety.
Mhm.
And again, that is the greatest responsibility that we have as a society. So if you are in that scenario, if you were there and you were actually intoxicated and actually using an illegal substance, you would face no criminal penalties. We just hope that you have the cognitive ability to pick up the phone and call, because we've heard of and seen tragedies where somebody could have saved a life if they would have just called 911, but were afraid to because they did not understand the Good Samaritan law actually provides them protection.
Sheriff, what else, with regard to what you're doing from the leadership with Project Opioid, should our listeners know about, how they can get involved, what they can be doing, and more specifically, understanding Narcan and how it works?
Well, our effort with Project Opioid is the first of its kind anywhere. It's actually bringing in the business community, the faith community, public and private sector partners, all coming around one common cause. And I think that, through Andre Bailey's leadership in pulling together these remarkable ambassadors of this cause, one of the things that we recognized early on was we needed to change the face of dependency, or what many refer to as addiction. There's this stereotype out there that every person who is on this journey is simply living under an overpass, and they've been introduced because they started with entry level, or what we call the gateway drugs, and we know that that's not always the case. Sometimes there's this narrative out there that there's a lack of resources, or you hear the narrative that there's not enough funding, and there are always very generous people who are willing to help. The initiatives that we've partnered with, we're not turning anybody away, and I think that the most important thing is to pick up the phone and make that call. There's also this effort of support groups, because behind every person who is navigating their course towards sobriety, there are 4, 5, 6, 10 people that actually are close and love that individual, that cry themselves to sleep at night wondering, uh, what can we do to help? And in the most part, in areas across the country, that is a very lonely process. And what we want to do through Project Opioid is to make that less lonely, and to make sure that we guide people. You can imagine that, giving somebody who's on this journey themselves Narcan is wonderful, but if they take that deadly dose and they go unconscious, they're not going to be able to deploy that on themselves. So getting naloxone or any opioid antagonist to the hands of family members and other people is incredibly important. But I think that the first takeaway is to help us change the face of this epidemic.
That's an amazing point, and really changing the narrative is so important. I mean, we've heard you say it, and we've said it time again, that this is a disease. I love your quote of not making a bad person good, but making a sick person well. And I think that's really what the idea behind Project Opioid is. And I had a wonderful opportunity to speak with some of the moms from the Seminole County Moms Group right before we talked today. And there is a great support system out there. What would you say, Sheriff, to a parent who is struggling? They have a child that they think is at risk for overdose. What would you say to that parent? How can they get support? How can they get help?
So they can just call us, call Aspire. Babette, Kate gave the phone number there. There are so many people out there that are well connected with the resources, and this does not have to be a lonely journey. But what is important is to look at behavior and characteristics. And sometimes as a society, we like to mind our business and we don't like to pry. And somebody who's on that journey is not going to come out and ask for help. If you study the biological effects of addiction, prolonged and sustained use of opioids affects the amygdala, and that's the middle part of the brain, that is the spontaneous part of the brain. And to put it in perspective, rational thought and decision making occurs in the frontal cortex of the brain. And when our minds are working properly, that amygdala sends signals to the frontal cortex, and that's where we come up with rational thought. But when somebody is only thinking and reacting in this spontaneous part, Dr. Aaron Wall, who works with us with Project Opioid, really describes it very well when he says, if you ever want to feel what it feels like to be dependent to a substance, have somebody hold you underwater for about 60 seconds and let you go. Your fight for the surface for air is the same fight for somebody who's dependent on the substance. So I want to tell parents and loved ones to be patient, to never give up. Relapse is a part of recovery. And this is, coming from a sheriff that has spent a majority of my life putting people in jail for committing violations. We still do that. We still are extremely aggressive on the drug dealer, but we realize that it is our responsibility to save people. And a little side note here is, we know that the number one predictor of whether or not somebody will overdose and die is whether or not they've overdosed and survived. And up
Right.
until this point, when somebody is overdosed, they've been hospitalized, they've been stabilized, but there's been very little customized services catered towards them. And I think that we're making some great progress with all of our partners here in Central Florida, and soon to be across the state with Project Opioid.
Sheriff, we're honored to have you. We heard from the sheriff today that you can reach out for help. You can, if somebody is using, they're overdosing, please reach out for that help. If somebody's not in that state, but yet still needs help, you can reach out to Aspire at 407-875-3700. And under the Good Samaritan, you are not going to get in trouble if you do that. Here's a sheriff that has taken so much of his time and his commitment to the opioid cause of saving lives, protecting public safety, and making sure that we continue to grow as a community the best way that we can. We greatly appreciate that and everything you're doing. We are very lucky to have you within our community and hope that other sheriffs can follow in your footsteps.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me on. And unfortunately, the reality is the hard work lies ahead of us, but we have the right team in place through Project Opioid to make the difference.
Okay, well, thank you again, Sheriff, for joining us. And we appreciate all the work that you've done as co-chair of Project Opioid. And we look forward to hearing more from what's going on in Seminole County soon.